Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer is Season 10's third entry into Death Battle's extensive history of Marvel vs. DC matches. I've already given my thoughts on matchups like it back in my Phoenix vs. Raven video, but to recap for those who haven't seen that one, I tend to find Cosmic Tier Marvel vs. DC episodes dull unless I already like the characters being used. If you want my more detailed thoughts on the matter, stick around until later in the video. In this episode's case, Martian Manhunter is one of the Justice League headliners I tend to enjoy more than the others, but I don't exactly have a ton of history with the character. He's cool enough, but he's not someone I was dying to see on Death Battle. Silver Surfer actually had it worse though, in that I honestly didn't know he had a character prior to this episode being made. That's not to say I didn't know who the Silver Surfer was, I obviously knew he existed. But you see, I didn't know he had a name, a past, and a personality, because all I'd ever really seen of him was that Fantastic Four sequel ages ago, and his presence as scaling fodder for Marvel's high tiers and versus debates. Consequently, I went into this episode mentally prepared to write it off as a 7 out of 10, largely due to my general disinterest in the matchup. I mean, if you had let me choose Death Battle's opponent for Martian Manhunter, I would have went with Super Skrull without batting an eye. Sure, it's not as thematic as Silver Surfer, but Super Skrull is that guy. I mean, just listen to what he has to say about Ryu.
You are the pinnacle of human perfection!
He just like me and my friends for real. Anyway, I was surprised by what this episode managed to put out. The actual debate isn't super interesting, but the writing here manages to execute some really interesting commentary on Death Battle's format while using both characters' personalities very effectively. And as far as I can tell, that's all due to the influence of one man. Peter B. Parker from Deadpool vs. The Mask. Joshua Kazumi has both the writers and directors roles for this episode. He's not a name that instantly jumped out at me when I looked at the credits for this episode, but once I realized he was the one who wrote episodes like Goro vs. Machamp and Yoda vs. King Mickey, everything made sense. Josh's episodes are usually very strong in terms of character writing, and he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do with Mansurfer since this was a dream matchup of his. So naturally, Manhunter vs. Surfer turned out to be very strong in that department. If you look at a lot of the buzz surrounding this episode, you'll see the team talking a lot about how unique it is, and the general audience talking about how emotional it was. As far as I'm concerned though, this didn't resonate with me the same way it seems to have resonated with other fans of the show. There's some good stuff that was put into this episode's production that I recognize and appreciate, like great writing and high quality animation, but it just wasn't enough to overcome my lack of interest in the matchup. And that ultimately stems from one thing: an overabundance of Marvel and DC representation. But before I get to that, the real meat and potatoes of this topic, I have to focus on the vegetables of the dish, those being the analyses. Okay, that metaphor was pretty clumsy. I mean to say that the analyses here are solid enough, but not what I expect to rewatch this episode for in the future. They take an interesting approach to covering the characters that I actually appreciated, that being shifting most of the abilities and feats to the earlier half of the rundowns. I think half of the reason Marvel and DC episodes feel so stale to me is that we're often waiting for the characters' stories to peter out just so we can hear about the same tired feats and scaling. But this gets that stuff out of the way and frees up the rest of the analyses to do what this episode actually wants to do. Reflect on the characters of J'onn J'onzz and Norrin Radd, and how their statuses as the last of their respective kinds inform their views on life. When the analyses are doing that, they're actually pretty friggin' great. My surface level knowledge of J'onn and Norrin made learning about their tragic histories incredibly impactful, especially in the former's case. The thought of taking on the shape of your own family in order to trick yourself into thinking they're not dead and gone is a deeply haunting one, and it makes the Manhunter's dedication to protecting all life even more admirable. I didn't find myself quite as taken in by the Silver Surfer's story, and that's generally reflective of my preferring Martian Manhunter's analysis as well as just liking J'onn more in general. In terms of the versus side of these rundowns, the feats being covered are presented in a way that makes their context interesting. This is frankly a godsend because both Manhunter and Surfer are so far beyond our understandings of finite power and speed that I would have been bored to tears if they were just laid out like a respect thread and I was expected to just get something out of them on my own. Their stats were very reminiscent of Phoenix and Raven's, even including some of the exact same feats and scaling from that episode, but I enjoyed Mansurfer's way of approaching them much, much more. To quickly skim over the points of the analyses I liked in particular, since I really don't have the energy to do what I did in my Guts vs. Dimitri video again, I liked Wiz's unenthused realization that DC likes its evil supermen way too much. Boomstick blowing his top over Mr. Mixixpiddle's name was funny. The oversimplification of Jean fighting Perpetua was a good way to ground such an absurd set of feats. The discussion of Jean's fire weakness was interesting, even if the cutaway gag was pretty mid outside of the community reference. Boomstick appreciating Norin's name and hero title was a fun subversion of the tired out haha, character's name is dumb joke. I liked the note about Surfer watching The Wizard of Oz 1,000 times. It's good to see someone with a hyperfixation that rivals my passion for Guts Dimitri. Sorry, did I say Guts Dimitri? I meant Ant-Man vs. the Atom. Jim Davis's Galactus art being included was a nice addition, almost making up for the tragic lack of Hank Hill in this episode. Boomstick spouting Surfer lingo smacked of corporate boardroom trying to appeal to kids energy, and not really in a good way, though I do find his sunburn pattern pretty amusing. The Death's Door joke started off feeling forced and heavy-handed, but the doormat edit made the whole thing worth it. I audibly sighed with relief when Deadpool didn't insert himself into the analysis after Boomstick threw shade at him. And the end to Surfer's analysis made me see his melancholy journey through the cosmos for the heroic act that it is. So overall, not bad analyses by any means, but not really anything terribly memorable for me. What massively helped round out these analyses and lift them above mediocrity was the editing, and I gotta say, massive props to Parker for his work here. Part of me wonders if he saw reviews of Phoenix vs. Raven like mine and took all of the criticism of the editing there to heart, because this is a huge step up from his work on that episode. There's a lot of great motion graphics and visual jokes that make watching the analyses a fun experience, breathing life into the static comic panels and focusing in on parts of the quotes and pages so the viewer knows what to focus on. There are a couple of panels where the text is too blurry to read, but overall this is a great step in the right direction for Parker. Again, well done, dude. So yeah, overall these analyses were pretty alright. They don't come close to a lot of the other episodes' rundowns from this season, but they're a good benchmark compared to the others if you ask me. It's healthy for Death Battle to just have solidly good content every now and then to balance out the masterpieces and the underperformers, and I think that sentiment applies to both the analyses and to the animation here. Now, that's not a take I expect to gel with the popular opinion this time around. Basically, everywhere I've looked for opinions about this episode's fight, I've seen people lauding it with a ton of praise for its character-driven scenario and emotional ending. And it's not like I don't think those elements of the animation are praiseworthy, far from it actually. I just happen to find those elements on their own as being greater than the sum of their parts. First of all, this animation is so damn pretty to look at. Jean and Norin's sprites look great, the effects and background elements are super well done, and the movements and action are all animated super fluidly. Like, look at how seamless this rotating shot of Surfer is. They did not need to make a scene this minor look so smooth. Things are top-notch from an audio perspective too. The sound design is on point in most aspects, with a personal favorite of mine being the sharp, piercing sound of Martian Manhunter's psionic blasts. But the voice acting is especially worth praising. I have no idea what Silver Surfer is supposed to sound like, but Paul Goyette captures his melancholy existence pretty nicely with a mostly monotone delivery that felt sort of Dr. Manhattan-esque. Cameron Nakad steals the spotlight as Martian Manhunter though. His voice is a dead ringer for Carl Lumbly, and every line and effort he delivers is super pleasing to the ear. The track's not half bad either. Mind Over Matter isn't the kind of death battle song I'll listen to on my own time, but it's very cinematic and grandiose in a manner befitting a battle in space. The part toward the end where the choir ramps up during the sun scene is especially beautiful, and I never get tired of hearing it during the battle. Now let's discuss the scenario and tone of the battle, because like the team says, it's very unique compared to most other episodes in Death Battle's catalog. When I first saw the sneak peek, I was very confused about the setup because both Jean and Norin were acting like the other was the instigator of the fight. But as it turns out, that was very much intentional, because the major through line of this battle is that neither Manhunter nor Surfer are sure of why they're fighting. In fact, they come closer to realizing they're in a death battle than any non-fourth wall breaker has in the show's history, which makes a lot of sense with how cosmically aware these two are. My problem with this cool concept for a scenario comes with the fact that it kind of takes a backseat for most of the animation's runtime. From the point where Surfer is trapped by asteroids up to the point that Manhunter is blasted into the sun, it's just a rather uneventful flight through space, with most of the choreography amounting to laser blasts, telepathic attacks, and melee strikes, all of which have a lot of slow points between them that make the pacing feel sluggish. In this episode's commentary track, Liam made the observation that between the choreography and the dialogue-heavy moments, it feels very much like a fight made in a comic book that was translated into a sprite animation. The thing about that is that comic books, by virtue of being still images assembled into a story, cut out a lot of the downtime between attacks and dialogue that would realistically be there otherwise. This is what makes them still able to flow well in ways that a one-to-one animated adaptation wouldn't be able to, which I feel is very apparent with this fight. To get more into that, let's break down the fight beat by beat. The start is just as good as everyone says it is. I really like the noir film style they used while Jean and Norrin were assuming their human appearances. The detective's office is full of fun little Easter eggs that relate to other death battles, which I always enjoy being able to pick apart. This opening dialogue establishes the mystery of the fight and further differentiates it from other Cape Shit entries. Then Surfer resists Manhunter's mental attack and busts out, leading to a really sick title card in the vein of something like an old Universal monster movie. I love this aesthetic, and I really hope the Death Battle team does an episode where something like this can be the style of the whole animation. No ideas come to mind though, so I guess it'll just have to go untapped forever. With the film noir style being retired, Surfer races away through space while Manhunter gives chase, phasing through the obstacles in his way to differentiate their methods of fleeing and pursuit. To block off Surfer's escape, Manhunter uses telekinesis to pull some asteroids toward him. This isn't super clear when the camera pans toward the incoming asteroids though, since it's hard to tell which of them are just adrift in space and which are moving towards Surfer, especially when the camera doesn't linger on this angle for very long. Surfer tries to blast the rocks away with slow, individual bursts of the power cosmic, only to get swarmed and trapped by them as Manhunter speaks in his mind, goading him into spilling his secrets. I love how this line from Manhunter was delivered, but when Surfer recovers from shock, I guess? He phases through the rocks and is now the one chasing a fleeing Manhunter. The following chase scene has some pretty visuals and varying perspective shots to spice things up, but those don't distract from how long this chase goes on for. It's a full 20 seconds of Surfer just flying after Manhunter while occasionally shooting laser beams at him, which Jean barely has to even try to dodge. The fact that Space Hawaii from Stitch vs. Rocket and the Randy Kool-Aid Man constellation can be seen in the background here cannot save this section from being a very boring stretch of the animation. It gets cooler when a whole swarm of Manhunters appears around Surfer though. I take this to be an illusion created by Jean, since I don't remember hearing about any cloning abilities of his in the analysis. This makes his strategy interesting, since he's not trying to overwhelm Norrin with a bunch of mental probing from different angles. Yes, I am fully aware of how that sounds. He's using the illusory copies to hide his real self, keeping Surfer off of him while he attacks in the one way he does best, telepathically. And this actually works for a moment, making Surfer shoot lasers at the fakes before turning into the funny Game Over sprite from the Silver Surfer NES game. But the Power Cosmic's field awareness lets him hone in on the real Jean, making for some good cohesion with how he would be able to resist mental attacks as stated in the conclusion. Following this, Manhunter responds to Surfer saying he can feel his presence by just shooting him in the face with a psionic blast. This is clearly not meant to be humorous, but I find the attack to just have some great comedic timing despite that, so it gets a solid exhale that's not quite a laugh from me on rewatches. This knocks Norrin off his board, and Manhunter takes the opportunity to snap it in half before shapeshifting into a fucking awesome dragon animated by Morrow. One thing I want to note is that the way Surfer's board gets broken here doesn't line up with how Manhunter's arms move, which is weird because the action is drawn correctly in the storyboards. It's hard to see without pausing the animatic, so I can understand how the animators might have missed that detail, but it's still a jarring inconsistency that stuck out to me nevertheless. But that doesn't distract at all from how awesome this fight becomes once Manhunter goes full Firebrand on Surfer. Norrin's deadpan yet wide-eyed look of awe is perfect, and the way Jean's shadow looms over the planet behind Surfer before his claw swipe easily shreds through it is fucking jaw-dropping. Surfer rides along as Dragon Jean flies after him, with the sound design of his claw swipe and bite attack nailing the size difference from Surfer's perspective. Then he gets tail slapped off his board, but rebounds smoothly and encases Manhunter in energy, forcing him to revert to his standard size. Surfer then grabs him and throws him into the sun along with some rebounded psionic energy, leading to some of my favorite efforts in this season so far. Jean's grunts of pain and fear as the sun's fire surrounds him is so perfect, and so is his roar of effort as he shuts out the sensation to keep his nerves about him. Surfer then flies in and we get a cool exchange of one-liners before they clash one last time, with Surfer stripping Manhunter of his resistance to the sun's heat and blasting him with the Power Cosmic. Manhunter retaliates by attacking Surfer's mind again while reverting to his natural Martian form, leading them to both realize that neither of them really started the fight. This is that pseudo fourth wall break I alluded to before, where they realize that they're being compelled to fight to the death for some unknown reason. It's a cool twist to the format that fits these characters, and I like Manhunter's last line as he expresses his hope that Surfer can live without knowing why their fight had to happen. And while I like Surfer's monologue on its own, it is kind of a letdown that Manhunter's loss is obvious from his last line and his death goes on for almost 30 seconds. Cool monologue and great visuals aside, it ultimately amounts to both a disintegration and an explosion death, which in fairness are really the only ways you could kill Manhunter with his regeneration taken into account. And the end of the fight is Surfer mourning Manhunter's death as the title card text returns to mark the battle's conclusion. This fight kind of frustrates me, but not because of anything to do with it being bad. It's more so for the fact that I can see all of the things that make people adore this episode and give it 10 out of 10 scores left and right, but I just don't feel the same love for it. And I think the reason for that, along with the legitimate issues I have with it, boils down to the fact that I would have loved all of these concepts for a unique battle if they were just used in something other than a Marvel vs. DC matchup. I know that's not going to win me a lot of support from this episode's fans, and trust me, I'm not really happy to have that opinion either. I wish I could set that crap aside and just enjoy the presentation of this episode, especially since it's one of Josh's dream matchups, but I can't help the way I feel. I am tired of Earth 616, Prime Earth, and these characters. I am tired of being caught in the tangle of their rivalry. I can enjoy Marvel vs. DC episodes when they're well made, but is it wrong that I would rather they just not happen anymore? Is it unfair of me to say that I'd rather the creativity behind these episodes be put into something that uses new characters and series, rather than into another comic book versus comic book matchup? Maybe it is. I don't know. If you haven't seen it already, Nemesis made a great video on this topic recently that basically summarizes the points behind people's lack of enthusiasm for Marvel vs. DC fights. And I find myself identifying with a lot of what he said. A lot of my attachment to certain Marvel and DC characters comes from auxiliary media like cartoons, games, and movies. And so when they keep coming to death battle with the comics being the main point of analysis, I have very little to connect to there. I'm not a big comic book guy. Maybe that's why I tend to enjoy it more when Marvel and DC characters fight opponents from other properties. At least when someone like Rocket comes in to fight Stitch, I might not be able to connect with Rocket's full history within the nebulous web that is Marvel Comics, but I can at least focus on the contained stories Stitch is from and just rely on my basic understanding of Rocket to get me through the episode. At least when Super Friends Aquaman is brought on to fight SpongeBob, I can go into the episode expecting a fun analysis that touches on the campier side of DC, something I find much more enjoyable than the endless thread of unending stories that continues to be spun in the comics. All of that is to say, no matter how many unique or unconventional things a death battle does, I won't care as much if it's being done in a fight where the headliners are two characters from franchises I am deeply burned out on. Maybe I'm just really feeling it with this one because it happened so soon after Phoenix vs. Raven, which practically embodies everything I just said about why I don't care for these Marvel vs. DC matchups. I'm just struggling to stay focused on its objective qualities when I see people say the ending of Manhunter vs. Surfer made them more emotional than Magneto vs. Tetsuo. I just can't grasp it, and that's really been eating away at me with this episode. I'm sorry for going on such a rant, but I wanted to get my feelings on the matter out there, both to see if people are receptive to them and whether or not I'm just being a stick in the mud. I do my best to make these reviews a balance between objective criticisms and subjective opinions, but it's not always easy with something like this, which I know to be a hot-button issue in this community. Getting back to the episode itself, Manhunter vs. Surfer's conclusion is pretty solid, if a bit one-note. It can pretty much be summed up as the power cosmic making the Surfer the only one here who could actually kill the other, whereas Jean could really only rely on mental attacks. I wonder if the idea of stats being so cosmically high as to be irrelevant to the debate will soon be a running theme with comic book matches like this, since both this and Phoenix vs. Raven came down to abilities in the end. Weirdly enough, this episode has been the hardest one for me to talk about so far. I knew the gist of what I wanted to say about it, but splitting hairs to keep my opinions on Marvel vs. DC matchups out of the objectively great elements this episode has going for it has been headache-inducing, not gonna lie, Wiz. Manhunter vs. Surfer gets a 7 out of 10 from me. It basically lived up to what I wanted it to be. A solid enough middle ground for Season 10 to base itself on. I don't think I'll remember much about it a couple of episodes from now, and I for one am fine with that. Finally, before we wrap things up here, I'm glad we already knew Bill Cipher vs. Discord was going to be the next time. Because could you imagine if this trailer was our first reveal of its placement in the season order? Not only does Discord get more clips in it than Bill does, but the music makes me feel like I'm sitting in a tavern waiting to start a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. A weird note to end on, but oh well, next time's gonna be fucking insane regardless. A calmer trailer won't hurt anyone. If you've made it to this point in the video, I salute you. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to see me and my friends react to Manhunter vs. Surfer, the link to that video will be in the description, as will other Death Battle content creators you should check out. I'll see you soon for the weirdness that's to come. Later.